Right. My name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with Robin Howell. We're at Sokol Blosser Winery in Dayton. It's July 11th, 2023. And Robin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for asking.
First question to get things started is why wine?
It's a good question. I don't have a real sharp answer for that. I got interested with my father, who's really into wine and food, and that was his career. And I started going to wine dinners with him, just something new to share together. My mom wasn't as interested, so it was sort of something fun to do after I finished my undergrad and I was living back with my parents because, I was broke. so living the 21-year-old dream. So I started going to these dinners and I just was intrigued at the food and wine pairings, and it would be a different winemaker or a different distributor at each wine dinner, and just learning, kind of about the world through wine. And I really opened my eyes to the world in general, and I loved that culture part of it that wine brought to understanding more and more about the world. And so that was the beginning of my interest in wine. And actually, my dad suggested I study food science, and I thought that was a ridiculous major. I didn't know what you could possibly do with that, but I was wrong. And I ended up studying genetics, but I knew a lot of people in the food science major, and they told me about a career fair going on in their department, and I went over there and I met a few winemakers looking for, for harvest interns, and one thing led to another, and I was working a harvest, and then it's been downhill ever since.
We're going to come back and pick that up there in a second, but let's talk about life before wine a little bit. You mentioned undergrad. Tell me about where you're born and raised and kind of life before school.
Yeah. So I was born in Michigan, raised in Michigan, right here in the mitten, very important. And grew up right by Michigan State. So although we didn't have a farm, we were not an ag family. I was, surrounded by farms in the ag industry. So I enjoyed that aspect of it. And I was curious about ag in general, growing up in that environment. And then, so growing up, I went up to the Upper Peninsula a lot and fell in love with that area of the state. And so when it came to undergrad, I went to school way far up north in Michigan, as far as you could go and still pay in-state tuition. So although I was interested in going to Michigan State, I actually had a friend of the family who was a professor there, and he recommended not going to such a big university for undergrad. So I chose a small university and I studied biology. And then, so I was there for 4 years at Michigan Tech University, and then came back home and worked at Michigan State for a couple years. Studying in a lab that was studying plant genetics, and worked there for 2 years. And I was interested in genetics already, and then I liked the plant science side of it. So that work experience led me to my graduate studies, which was in plant genetics at Oregon State. My brother lived in Washington. I loved the West. And so graduate school seemed like the opportunity to come out here. Mm-hmm. And I thought I'd just be here for a couple years, doing my master's study, and then go back home to Michigan. But here I am many years later with a career and a life, and yeah.
When you were heading into graduate school, what did you sort of think you'd be doing with your master's degree?
I thought I'd be doing research science. I would be a lab rat. I pictured going back somewhere to research Triangle Park in Raleigh or outside of Raleigh, North Carolina. Doing something with genetics, but in a research environment. possibly at a university, but yeah, I didn't really see the world outside of a lab. I mean, I liked it out there, but I didn't know I was such a lab person, and that was my comfort zone. So that's where I gravitated towards. And that's actually how I got into the wine industry, as I was working in a wine lab. So.
Well, let's talk about that. And we'll actually talk about Oregon first. So you mentioned kind of having an affinity for the West before coming here. Tell me about your first impressions of Oregon and of Oregon State.
I mean, I thought it was so cool that you could go to the coast one day and then go skiing the next day. I just thought that was phenomenal. And in Oregon, you can do that in the summer because you can go up to Timberline and ski on the glacier. So and I loved all the green and the change in topography. And I loved that exposure of living in the valley. And then Oregon State, I loved living in Corvallis. I just thought it was a great college town. Gave me a chance to do club rowing, which I enjoyed. And then, I had a really good advisor in terms of, he brought in a lot of money, so there was a lot of opportunity for research there. And for whatever reason, there were a lot of South Americans in my department, and they were here to study and to explore everywhere in Oregon. And they were all really interested in wine. And back then, you could go wine tasting for free or $5. So as a graduate student, you could afford to get out and go wine tasting on the weekends. So we did a lot of wine tasting, which I just also thought was fascinating, that I could drive 30 minutes and be tasting wine in several different facilities. And yeah, I mean, that was such a rich opportunity to, again, experience all these different, it was just eye-opening, all these different wines that were available, from Pinot Noir to Pinot Gris. Sparkling wasn't really a thing then, but Riesling, and experience with my friends from South America, and just, again, that interlaying of world experiences. So, yeah, and then I just fell in love with being out here and all the opportunity.
Mm-hmm. So tell me about you mentioned kind of the wine lab and the kind of the career fair as kind of the gateway. So which happened first? What was your kind of first foray into wine work?
Wine work. So yeah, so I went over to this career fair in the food science department. Actually, I started in the viticulture and enology club at Oregon State. And I went out to the vineyard that Oregon State owns and did pruning. And I just thought that was so cool. That was so cool. And so then after that was the career fair. So I went over there thinking I would do something more on the viticulture side. Yeah, it was just more connected to the vineyard. That was just more tangible, I guess. The agriculture and all that. So I went over there, was interested in viticulture. I talked to Lindsay Boudreau, who was at King Estate. So I connected with her and really was trying to get a vineyard experience. But she convinced me that there would be more opportunity for me in the enology side of things. And they were looking for a harvest intern in the lab. And I mean, I had tons of lab skills. I knew how to run a pH and titrate. I could titrate anything. So, yeah, so that was my introduction. And she gave me the opportunity to work harvest at King Estate back in 2005. So that was my introduction into the wine lab. And then I thought I would just do that for fun, for harvest, and then I'd get a real job back doing research. And here I am 20 plus years later, or about 20 years later, still looking for that real job.
What was that first harvest like? What do you remember from it?
It was overwhelming. I had never worked those sorts of hours. I had never, I mean, on the one hand, it was fine because I didn't have any friends in Eugene. So it's not like I had a life there. I was moving up from Corvallis. But yeah, I was overwhelmed by the hours and the intensity. But it was also ridiculously fun because you're all in it together. So that does become your circle. Your life is all the other interns, the permanent employees. That becomes your circle. And so it was exhausting and just so much fun. And it was just wild to see all this fruit come in, and then at the end of the day have a beverage that you enjoy drinking. And the smells, I mean, the smells were unreal. I'd never smelled fermentation before. So then it was just sort of love after that. And my supervisor, Lindsay, got promoted while I was there, and so there was a job opening in the lab. So again, I was like, well, I'll just work in the lab for a year, and then I'll get a real job. And then I was there for 5 years.
So tell me about that. Obviously, we hear about the harvest rush and the kind of the harvest high a lot. Tell me about the other parts of the year and learning full-time work at a winery.
Yeah, I definitely feel like that was a benefit for me to almost start in a permanent position. I mean, I started as an intern and then it moved into a permanent position because there's so much that happens after fermentation to really bring the wine into the bottle. So that was a great exposure because then after working there for 5 years, I did go and intern at a few places. So I kind of had a grasp of where the wine goes next, even though I wasn't seeing it to completion. But it's interesting because every year is different, but every year is the same. You have harvest, you have the harvest high, then the harvest low, and then you move into blending, which is fascinating to see how different wines can be with just the smallest tweak. Like you think 2% is not that much, but depending on what the variables are, you can really change the dynamic of the wine. So learning the blending. And then the bottling, like the precision that comes with bottling. I mean, so much of harvest is not precise. And then you get to bottling and, that's when things get really detailed and, it's the last chance to touch the wine before it goes out to the consumer. So you're doing, you've got your harvest, your blending, and then your bottling, and then it starts all over again. So it's the same thing year after year, but every single year is different because of the challenges of the environment. The growing season. Do you have a big harvest, a small harvest?
So how did your role evolve at King Estate while you were there?
So I was always the lab manager when I was there, but I did, I was very fortunate because they sent me to a lot of classes. At that time, it was a lot of classes at UC Davis. Their not community ed, but extension classes. So that was pretty special to be able to do that. Every single seminar that was going on in the valley, especially at Schmidt, I got to go to. It was before Linfield had a wine program. But I would have been sent to those had that been a different time. So that was a lot of my exposure, and I went to California a handful of times just to tour other labs and learn about their equipment, learn how their lab managers or their enologists fold into their winemaking program. And because I didn't have an enology degree, I was developing sort of my own position there. I mean, overseeing the lab, but then how do I learn to be a winemaker at the same time? Whereas previous lab managers there were enologists already. So I had to learn that science. But it just, just every vintage, obviously learning, and then having the opportunity to get out and go to these classes and meet people and just make that contact out was how I evolved in my position there. And I took on more packaging, procurement responsibilities as I was there. Oversaw a lot of the cork purchasing. I had the opportunity to go to Portugal when I was there. So all those just developed my curiosity, developed my palate, developed my enology understanding, and just meeting people. Because especially down in Eugene, you're pretty isolated in the wine industry. So getting out and meeting more people, because you can't really make wine, I don't think, in a silo. Like, you need to have other people. You need to have other people to bounce ideas off of, or when you're having a struggle, how do I remedy this issue? So I felt very lucky that I got to have that opportunity. But then it felt very isolated after 5 years, so I left. I needed to explore other things, other opportunities. So.
Well, before we get to that, I have one last question.
One last
about that. As you're there, tell me about sort of what's the role of the enologist in the finished product? What do you feel like are the contributions of that lab manager enologist role towards the finished wine?
I would say they're the deep detail person. Like, the winemaker paints the broad strokes and gives the imagination to the wine. And then the enologist is the technical person. They're making sure the chemistry is tight, or that the winemaker is aware of the chemistry and can make a decision if they want to tighten things up. What kind of sulfur level do they want going into the bottle? And how does that relate to when it's going to go out into the market, or how it's going to age, or the style of the wine? So I think that the winemaker is the broad brush strokes, and the enologist outlines everything, gets everything to a fine point. So I find that that's very complementary. Mm-hmm. For me, it works for my brain, because sometimes I get a little bogged down in the details, and that is something I'm definitely working on, is stepping out and looking at the bigger picture, mm-hmm. because that is my training as a lab person, a scientist, and then stepping out into the big picture.
So 5 years there, you feel like it's time to kind of take the next step. So at that point, were you looking for a specific role or a specific part of the industry, or were you just sort of looking?
So at that point, I'd only worked in the lab. I could write a work order, but I couldn't execute a work order, mm-hmm. because I didn't have all the pump skills or, dragging hoses. So that seemed wrong, to be able to tell people what to do, but not be able to do it myself. I can tell you why you're doing it, but I can't tell you how to do it. Mm-hmm. So the next opportunity I took was to I wanted to go to a big winery in New Zealand, and drag a hose, hook up a pump. I wanted to follow the work orders, mm-hmm. so that I knew what I was doing, not just why, but how to physically make things happen. So that's what I was looking for. I wanted to be in the cellar. I did not want another lab job. Fortunately, the position I ended up with was at a big facility in Marlborough, tons of Sauv Blanc, but it did end up being a bit of a combination with the lab. I was doing fermentation checks. So I was still really connected with the winemaking, and there were several different winemakers there, so that was pretty special to be able to pull the samples, taste with the winemakers. I didn't get to taste everything, but I would taste a lot of stuff with the winemakers, and get their opinions. There were a lot of people making their own production there, small production, so you got a variety of opinions, mm-hmm. on style. So I would do fermentation checks in the morning, and then in the afternoon I would do rackings or inoculations. So, and these are on huge tanks. So, you're using pumps, you're using hoses to do these inoculations. And it was just, I mean, that was a riot. I would tell anybody to have that experience, even if they ultimately want to work in a small place. I mean, you meet so many people, because there's people from all over the world coming there. So you meet such a diversity of people that just increases your opportunities out in the industry, not only your knowledge, but your connections. And it was just really fun.
What did you think about that part of the work, about dragging hoses and hooking things up?
I really loved it. It was very satisfying. I mean, there's something about coming home from work and being physically exhausted, which is, has its own fulfillment. And I just felt, I don't know if smarter is the right word, but I felt more well-rounded by having that experience and not just writing work orders and telling other people what to do. So no, I loved it. I loved being able to hook up the hoses and run the pumps. And actually, I had another winemaker later who told me, when I was talking to him about, what are the next steps do you think I need to advance my career? And he said, you need to understand how equipment works, mechanical. And I was like, that doesn't make sense. I just need to work on my palate. But he was 100% right, because winemaking is about a palate, but it is also about logistics and equipment to make the process happen. So.
And was there a reason you chose New Zealand specifically?
Yes, because I was old. And they have the visa program for people under 30 to go, and it's very easy in Australia and in New Zealand. But in New Zealand, it was easier to get a special visa, because it's such a small country and there's more demand for employment. And because I had the 5 years of experience running a lab in a winery, that made me more, it validated my experience in terms of getting the visa. So, so it just made it easier to get a visa. Australia's, it's so big and they have so many employees or potential employees, so I just couldn't. So yeah, it was logistics. I mean, I was curious to go to New Zealand. I mean, that's fantastic. And I'm really glad I ended up there. But that is why. Because I came to the industry and that side of things, the traveling, a little bit later.
So as you're wrapping up your time in New Zealand, what were you sort of thinking about for next step?
I came back to Oregon. I was not done traveling, but coming back to Oregon seemed the most intriguing at the time to work someplace else in Oregon, and I know it was just because it was familiar. I'd taken a big step by going to New Zealand alone and exploring that, but I wanted to come back and see friends and be back in Oregon. And so that I came back here, worked a harvest, actually at Domaine Serene up the hill, and met some really fantastic people working there, folks I'm still friends with today. But yeah, that was just, I guess, one step, but I knew I wanted to keep traveling and keep having other experiences. I did come back knowing I didn't want to work in a huge facility again, that was my experience, and it was totally worth it. I think it's an important experience, but I wanted to go back to smaller production and Pinot Noir focused. That was the other reason I came back to Oregon, is because I was really wanted to stay Pinot Noir focused. So then I came back here, worked harvest. I worked night shift, which was an experience. It's very strange to come home in the morning and sit at the table with your roommates, and they're eating cereal to get ready to go to work, and you're having your your after work beer at 8 a.m. because that's normal. The rules are a little different during harvest. So that was that experience. And then I went back to New Zealand. So this time I went to Central Otago. So continue on the Pinot Noir track. And Central Otago is pretty special because there's a lot of folks there that have worked in Oregon. So they have a big connection with Oregon and the Willamette Valley. And actually the winemaker I ended up working for, he had worked at Elk Cove for, I think, 5 years. He was an assistant winemaker. So he knew Oregon very well. And it was a smaller facility. I can't remember how many tons we brought in, but it was probably like 200 tons or something like that. So that was fun because there was it was a pretty easy harvest. After working at King Estate, which was pretty good size then, and it's only gotten bigger, in Marlborough, it was pretty cruisy to go for 200 tons. Yeah, it was nice. I mean, we ate dinner at home, and banker hours started at 9. It was a good life. Had plenty of time to hike around and taste and travel, and it was a good time.
Yeah, they all should be so easy.
Yeah, yes. That was the first and last. Except for maybe 2016 here. 2016 was pretty cruisy. But yeah, I finished that, and I traveled to France after that. I went over to France just for fun and spent a lot of time in the Rhone Valley exploring. And then I started to get interested in sparkling wine when I was in Central Otago. I mean, I've always enjoyed sparkling, but I didn't really develop a passion for it until working at the facility in Central Otago. They were making a small amount. I don't even remember the case production, but I got to participate in the dosage trials, and that was mind-blowing to me. So that really stemmed my interest in sparkling wine. And so I was in touch with one of the winemakers I worked with at King Estate, who also made sparkling wine, his own sparkling wine. And he had a connection in the south of France that he connected me with, and because they make sparkling wine down there. And there's some passionate debate, if sparkling wine came from down there or from Dom Perignon and Champagne. But anyways, long history of making sparkling wine. So I connected with the winemaker down there, and I came back to the U.S. for the summer and then went back to the south of France for one more harvest. And I don't know because I haven't worked in Champagne, but I think I got probably a pretty rich experience working down there because the winemaker was incredibly open with information. So it was very much an educational experience. And actually just before that, when I was finishing my harvest in New Zealand the second time, I was like, maybe I was on the fence if this was really the career path I wanted to go on. Because I think I was feeling a little stagnant, even though I was having these, increasing experiences. I think it was a lull in my life and my career thought. And then I went to the south of France and just had such an enriching experience. Just tasted so many wines. He made a huge diversity of wines because in the south they grow so much. I mean, from sparkling base. He mostly made Brut, Pinot and Chardonnay base. But there were other odd varieties that they're growing down there to make sparkling. And so I got exposure to those. I mean, we made Merlot, Malbec, Cab Sauv, Pinot Noir, Syrah, Chardonnay. We made everything under the sun. And it was just basically me and the winemaker. So I did everything. That was a very physically demanding harvest. I mean, occasionally he would have some of the vineyard guys come in to do, to rack barrels, and because we had it on what's called stillage. So it wasn't forklifting, it was physically throwing the barrels up. So the vineyard guys would come in and do that for me. But I would fill the press myself, run the press myself. The winemaker would give me a list of things to do, and then he'd go into town and work in the office and come back in the afternoon, and we'd taste things. And so it was very hands-on. I was very independent, and that is what sealed it for me, that this was actually the career path I wanted to go down. And to make sparkling was the cherry on the top for me.
So at that point, you had a lot of experiences, a lot of different places, a lot of different sizes and styles. And had you started to kind of hone in on your sort of particular style or your sort of particular philosophy towards working in the winery?
Oh, that's such a good question. I wouldn't say. I say I really developed that when I started working at Sokol Blosser. And I think that's really because at this point I'm tied with the vineyard. I have a relationship now with all the blocks that we're processing, whereas before it was really just grapes coming in. I didn't have a necessarily a tie to the site. So I guess I would say that was where I started to develop what was important to me, which was a tie to the site. So in that regard, yes, I knew I wanted a connection with the site. I didn't want to work at a huge bulk facility just pushing through wine, which has its value, of course, but that wasn't. I wanted to make site-specific wines. So I guess that's style, be it whatever the site gives you is ultimately the style. I knew I wanted to work with Pinot Noir and not the big reds, because I'm a white wine drinker, and Pinot Noir, I like the delicacy, the finesse of white wines and Pinot Noir. So that was a takeaway from my experience in France, was I wasn't going to work with Merlot and Cab Sauv. Not for me. I just had a palate more for the delicacies.
So after that, kind of the epiphany, or the kind of, like you said, it kind of seals that this is what you want to do. You have an idea of where you want to be and kind of what you want to do. So how did you go about finding sort of the next step for yourself?
I mean, I don't want to say it was luck, but it was definitely, the timing was fortuitous, because I came back to Oregon, and I was looking for jobs, but nothing was really coming up that piqued my interest. I was starting to apply for harvest jobs just because I needed to be doing something. So looking at going back to New Zealand again. And the woman who hired me, Lindsay, at King Estate, who brought me into this industry, really, she transitioned out of winemaking and was working as a sales rep for a glass supplier, and that glass supplier serviced serviced Sokol Blosser. And she ran into Alex Sokol Blosser at the airport, and he told her that they were creating a new position here, an enologist position. Russ Rosner was getting ready to retire. Alex Sokol Blosser was going to become the winemaker, but he needed more chemistry help because he also has other obligations for the business. And so he was talking to Lindsay at the airport in Eugene. I don't really know why he was in Eugene, but And Lindsay's like, actually, I think I do know, because I had stayed in contact with her over the years. I think I do know somebody who'd be looking for the job, who's looking for a job and would be perfect for this position. So she connected me with the position that was going to be opened here. And I think just, helped bring my resume to the top of the pile, because I assume they got a lot of resumes. So yeah, she's been very influential in my career. So that's how I ended up here. And I came and met with Russ and Alex, and it felt right because it was a smaller facility, but not teeny tiny. Like I wouldn't be working by myself like I was in France. It was a little too small. It was a great experience, fantastic experience, obviously career shaping. But I didn't really want to be making wine all by myself. And I didn't want to go back to a huge facility either. So it was kind of middle of the road, especially for Oregon, in size and production volume. And so it just felt right. And I liked working for a family, an established family. And I've really connected with Russ. He is very particular, very detailed, and so am I. So we clicked, and I actually came here for just to meet, just a casual talk, which of course is an interview, even if it's not an official interview. And Russ and Alex and I, we just hit it off, and then just cascaded from there. And yeah, now I'm here for 11 years. So I started as the enologist here.
So you mentioned there was kind of a role being created. Tell me about sort of finding your way into that role, and then and starting to kind of understand the place now that you were at a place that had its own vineyard.
Yeah, so it was interesting because I came in. Yeah, it was a new role. Russ was the scientist. Russ managed all of that side of things, and but they needed somebody who was savvy with Excel, who understood the chemistry, and they wanted to do more chemistry in-house. So I brought that to the table. So I brought in more, doing more lab work in-house. So that was pretty fun to be able to create a lab. I'd never done that before. It's not a huge lab. It's not like ETS or core enology, but it did bring in a lot of that skill set. So that was really fun because I'm still developing my palate. I'm still getting to know the vineyard site, but I'm getting to bring in my other skills, my other offerings to the company. And so that was kind of how I segued in, was just through the lab and that offering to the company. And I overlapped for 1 year with Russ. So he really spent a lot of time teaching me the database programs, managing packaging procurement. I learned a lot about labels, QCing labels. There's a whole side of winemaking that nobody talks about, which is the packaging, because it's not very sexy, but it's so important. So I learned that skill, and although sometimes I complain about it, I actually also really enjoy going through the labels and getting the label order in, and all that logistical movement of packaging procurement. So I learned that side of the business, which was a huge thing for me. And took that off of Russ's plate as he was retiring, and not something that Alex had the bandwidth to take on. So that was my way to sort of carve out a niche here at Sokol Blosser. And then obviously I sat in on the tastings. So just, for a while it was just observing what other people are tasting, how they're tasting, what does each block give, what are people's perceptions of what each block gives. So a lot of it was just observation for a year, because that was my approach. And then getting out into the vineyard that summer. I was here, I started in July, So I was really thrown into the growing season. And so I just spent a lot of time with Alex going out into the vineyard and learning each block and studying the map. And, you know, it's, yeah, that was how I got into, segued into Sokol Blosser. And then one thing led to another, and then I was assistant winemaker, and then associate winemaker, and now I'm today the winemaker. So it's been an adventure.
Well, I want to talk about those steps in a second, but I'm curious about something first. You've mentioned throughout kind of developing your palate, and so I'm curious about, as you developed a palate, have you had to sort of redevelop it with each step? I mean, by the time you got to Circle Blosser, obviously you tasted a lot of wine, you've had a lot of wine. What did you still have to learn on your palate when you got here?
I think the biggest thing learning here was structure, learning acid and structure. I think the easiest things to begin with are, you know, identifying fruit components in a wine. And I had taken some classes on, you know, off aromas and developed that. So I had those pretty tidied, but learning the structure of wine, and the implications of your decisions during fermentation and how they impact structure. And then your oak. That was another big thing when I came here. I didn't have a lot of knowledge on barrels and barrel influence on the wines. I mean, certainly I knew the barrels influenced it, but I didn't get down to the nitty-gritty of each cooper and each toasting and how they impact the wine, and how Pinot Noir paired with one cooper might not match the Pinot Noir grown from a different vineyard section. So getting to know how each vineyard section related to the oak profile. So that was, so learning oak and learning structure were the big things that I had to take on this starting at Sokol Blosser. We did a lot of extended maceration when I first started here, so like 30 plus days on the skins after fermentation was complete. So tasting through that, which is a very scary process, because the wine is good when it finishes, and then it sits there on the skins and it gets bitter and jagged and unbalanced, and then literally in a day you taste it and the wine completely changes. So getting comfortable with that. That the wine will recover, the wine will bounce back, and learning that patience.
You mentioned kind of the year of observation of other people's perspectives on sort of the blocks here and on their characteristics. Tell me about then sort of charting your own path and learning the vineyard from your perspective.
A lot of that for me started when I was tasting the juice. So once after a year and tasting the finished wine, and then really being part of the berry sampling and tasting that juice and tasting it at the beginning of fermentation, that gave me even more of a connection with each block. And then at that point, knowing the blocks a little bit better, knowing how the soil changes on our hillside, and seeing how that can impact the juice, impact the fermentation, impact the finished product. That just gave me more confidence in understanding what people were saying, what the team was already saying about the wines, instead of just taking it at face value. I could see how that blue fruit came into the wine. How the Jory soil is known for red fruit, but there are different red fruits throughout our vineyard. So I would say that next year of knowing the vineyard a lot better.
Tell me where the Sokol Blosser was as a brand as you were coming into it, and kind of what the expectations were for its future, for what role you were going to play in it.
So one of the big things was that Alex and Allison really wanted a sparkling program. and Russ was not interested in doing that, which is totally understandable. Making sparkling wine is ridiculous. It's definitely a passion project. So that was a big part of why I think I was hired, because I had the interest. I had some pretty decent knowledge on sparkling production. So I had that role. Yeah, so we were starting to develop more of an entry level. We have beautiful single blocks out there, which is, that's just about continuing that program, because they're the opportunity for the vineyard to speak for itself. So when I came on, we were developing more entry-level Pinot Noirs, or entry level. Mm-hmm. But we wanted them to be Pinot Noir. We wanted them to say Willamette Valley. For the wine to speak Willamette Valley. So developing those programs is, I would say, more not why I was brought in, but those were the directions at that time, to keep continuing forward on, coveting these single block vineyard sites and continuing those programs, but then also developing more diversity in our portfolio in terms of price points. And I would actually say that making entry-level Pinot Noir is far and away more challenging. And I feel like between that and making sparkling, I've become a stronger winemaker, because you might be having minimal touch on the wines that are for these elevated programs, but things are happening with that wine, and you accept it, but you don't necessarily understand why it's happening until you are working with Pinot Noir that's going into an entry-level program. So, because there's a little more tweak, a little more winemaking intensive. And same with sparkling, also very winemaking intensive. And every flaw is amplified. I would say both with sparkling and entry level. So learning how to avoid those flaws or remedy situations that have happened have made me a stronger winemaker, and I feel like that then also impacts these higher tier programs as well. It's a cascading results.
For sort of entry-level Pinot specifically, obviously this is kind of a common refrain for people who want to make that kind of the first Pinot Noir you're ever going to drink kind of wine. Tell me about the specific challenges and about trying to make that bottle of wine that's going to go out into the world and represent the Willamette Valley.
Yeah. So, you're limited by price point. So you can't buy the most expensive Pinot Noir. You have to strike a balance between Valley Floor Pinot Noir, which is totally fine. It just doesn't have that same layer and depth, complexity that you can get from, hillside, Jory soil Pinot. So you take this, less complex Pinot Noir, a little more simple, and what activities can you do during fermentation to pull out the best qualities you have in it. And then you get to know that site and what qualities that site can bring in, and then you have another site also on the valley floor, which is slightly different, but or slightly different clones, slightly different soil, could be, a little bit sloped. What qualities does that fruit have, and how do you, are you doing pump overs? Are you doing punch downs? Is it a yeast you choose to work with? Is it an enzyme you use for extraction? And what can you do with that fruit to bring out those qualities? And then you get to your blending. So you have example A and example B, and then they complement each other, and they fill in the holes that each of them lack. So and then you want it to be Willamette Valley. You want it to have that bright red fruit. You don't want it, because commonly Willamette Valley is a little more delicate. It's not heavy and juicy. It's, or at least, right now. Things will evolve over time, but it's just a delicate Pinot Noir. You don't want it to be unctuous. You don't want it to be high alcohol. You don't want it to be, you want sweet fruit, but not jammy fruit, because I think that's the Willamette Valley. So, and how do you do that without adding a bunch of sugar and blending in other varieties? How do you do that with just Pinot Noir? That's been our challenge and our learning experience.
Tell me about the transitions for you from enologist to assistant winemaker to associate winemaker. Before we get to the sort of the last step there, what were the biggest sort of learning curves or new responsibilities with the kind of as you were advancing up the ladder?
So for me here, the transition from enologist to assistant winemaker was, I would say, a little more gentle. Like, I was already doing a lot of those responsibilities. And it was just proving myself, proving that I did have a palate, that I thought I could think beyond just the minute details of the chemistry, that I could think about the logistics. So that to me was a pretty gentle transition. And then developing into associate winemaker was taking ownership and responsibility for things, which I was doing before, but even more so. Like, you're making decisions and you feel confident with those decisions. And yeah, I'm talking to Alex and I'm getting final approval from him, but I'm initiating these ideas because he's pulled in a million directions. So somebody needs to be looking at the wine all the time, and that was my role, was to look at the wine all the time. So, suggesting trials that we could do, suggesting blends to put together. That was a big part, actually, in transitioning from assistant winemaker to associate winemaker, was leading the blend trials. I would say that was the biggest transition, was leading the blend trials. And also participating in the barrel decisions. I was no longer just saying these are the barrels and we're going to put wine in them, and I'm told what wine to put in each barrel. I was saying which wine I thought, which sections paired best with which coopers, and really part of those discussions. So I would say taking more ownership in the winemaking decisions was the biggest transition in that step. In learning more about the logistics of the facility. I, before then, was, just sort of rolled with the punches, but then I was learning how to use the cross flow and learning not just how to use it, but how to fix it. And how to fix the cooling system when that would go down. So learning those not very dreamy parts of winemaking, but incredibly essential parts. And then hiring the harvest interns. Another important part of making sure winemaking happens during harvest.
With a brand like Sokol Blosser that obviously is established and kind of has a reputation, has a style of its own, how do you fit your style into that and bring your personality to the wines?
I'd say one big shift that has happened over the years is that I definitely like the bright fruit. And so that's been a stylistic change in the Pinot Noir that's come since being part of the team. And then I'd say the other aspects that I've brought in are more introduction of different varieties. So I've been very impactful in the sparkling program. Actually, with Alex, went on a trip to Champagne last year to really go to the motherland and really learn how to make sparkling. And so we've made some shifts since that experience. But I've really driven the sparkling program since its inception. I was given the opportunity to. and that was my interest. So influenced that in terms of making it more in the brut range. Definitely don't want it to be sweet, but want that fresh fruit character coming through. And then pushing to do some extended tirage, or adding that program to the sparkling. That I was a big proponent for that. And we released our first 8-year in tirage wine last year. I think it was last year. And it blew people's minds. So that was a nice foundation for wanting to push the program in general for longer time in tirage. The board really enjoys the wine. So that being able to have a small quantity that we had in extended tirage and being able to present that to the board and say, you can taste the difference. This is why we need to invest money in this way. So having multiple tiers of programs in terms of length of entourage. And then after working in New Zealand, I really loved Sauv Blanc. I mean, the fermentation aromatics from Sauv Blanc are fantastic. And so I brought that variety. It was in 2019, we finally got access to really good Sauv Blanc in the valley. So brought that program to Sokol Blosser. Those are probably the biggest additions that I've made. Yeah, I mean, I encourage more and more white wine varieties to be produced. I just really enjoy producing white wine. It's very challenging, I think, because I like the challenge of not having much to hide behind in terms of flaws. So it works with my science brain of, the details being really critical. Yeah.
So tell me about the 2020 harvest. Obviously a difficult year, and for everyone, a difficult year for wine especially. Tell me about the challenges of that harvest specifically, and sort of what kind of solutions you had to come up with on the fly.
Oh yeah, that was an experience. That was an emotional harvest. I mean, we had an amazing staff for that harvest, which made things more tolerable. But first it was scary, and then I'll be honest that a lot of the focus on what to do was stemmed by Alex. Like my focus just became the logistics of bringing in the fruit. Getting fermentation started right away, and Alex spent countless hours on the phone with people in Southern Oregon, and then everyone in the valley. Like, I mean, as awful as the whole experience was, like, it just showed how powerful the winemaking community is here in the valley. Like, there was no shame. Everyone was sharing everything. Everyone was sharing every technique they could come up with, all these numbers we were getting that we had no idea what to do with. We were all just sharing everything. So, yeah, I mean, I don't need to experience that again, but it was an interesting and powerful reminder of the community that we're in, that we're making wine in, and how lucky we are, I think. But a lot of decisions that were made on the fly were, we felt we had to produce. We didn't have crop insurance, so we felt like we needed to produce. So what are we gonna do? So we decided to, instead of doing really light wines off the skins, we went super heavy. Like, let's go as heavy as we can so that there's more space to strip things out, be it with charcoal or all the techniques that were out there. So that was our approach. And we tried, we didn't actually try RO ourselves. We did some trials. We tasted other people's trials. And RO, we worked with this magical resin product that was coming out of a company in California. So we tried that, and we thought that it did something to the wine. It made it palatable. Palatable enough to be blenders. We tried charcoal. We tried, we definitely did no extended maceration that year. It was off the skins as soon as possible. There was no cold soaks. Again, we inoculated as soon as that fruit came in. It was inoculated. We pushed it through fermentation in as tight a turnaround as we could. And we did the best we could with the limited knowledge that was out there. We did the micro ferments and, tasted for smoke impact there. But everything was smoke impacted. Different levels, but everything was smoke impacted. We tried doing, where we would saigner some and ferment that, a light colored Pinot and then super dark colored Pinot, super heavy tannic because of all the skins. We tried everything. But at the end of the day, I think our greatest success was to make as dense a wine as we could. Ferment it warm, use enzymes, and no, we did not use enzymes. We decided not to use enzymes because of the smoke. And then work with the resin and try to strip away as much as we could. We also used some oak adjuncts at the end to try to mask it a little bit, kind of amplify some cherry and vanilla characters. And actually, I think one of the biggest challenges out in the marketplace with that wine is that the media trashed it. So there was no real chance to prove yourself because people already had a preconceived notion on what it was. But we actually got some really good scores from the Spectator and the Enthusiast on our Evolution Pinot Noir and our Redland Pinot Noir and our Dundee Hills. So we got some 90 plus scores on those wines, which is wild. But they were still, and they still are, incredibly difficult to sell because people are judging the wines before they've even put them in their mouth. So, are those wines the best we've ever made? Certainly not. But I think we ended up with some decent wines, given the challenge of the vintage. I'm sure we're going to have that sort of incident again sometime. Hopefully it's not the entire vintage. I think that was a huge, huge hurdle that we had. It was really the entire vintage was smoke affected. So, but there's some incredible research that's being done with the support from Jackson family. So hopefully we're better equipped. And then the new lab opening at Oregon State. Hopefully between all this research and technology coming forward, we'll be better equipped for when this happens again.
So you mentioned that you're now the winemaker here at Circle Blosser.
Crazy.
Tell me about how that came to be and about stepping into that role.
Well, it was definitely not. It was a surprise to me. Not that they thought I could. It wasn't a surprise to me that they thought I could do it, but I worked with Sokol Blosser, who is about my age and loves winemaking. So I didn't really think that title was going to come to me here, and I didn't have an issue with that because I got tons of support, appreciation. I had all the accolades I needed to feel like I was appreciated here, so I didn't need that title. And I was very happy working here, so I didn't need to go somewhere else so that I could have that title. But family changes happened, and Alex became president of the entire company. And you can't be president of a company this size and be the winemaker. So it opened up this opportunity for me, and of course I had to say yes. They asked me, and I had to do a tasting with the board. But I mean, the only option was yes for me. And so yeah, it was a surprise. I was very surprised, very excited, very honored. I'm the 5th winemaker here, which is incredible. And actually, Alex is the only family member who's ever been a winemaker here. So, but yeah, I'm the first female winemaker for Sokol Blosser. And I had to do a tasting with the board, which I was terrified to do, even though I know these people, and they're not scary people, but it still feels different when they have the board before them. And it was a wonderful experience. So much so, I guess we're going to do it every year now. It was really fun to be able to talk about the wines with them, and how I wanted to carry them forward and things I wanted to change, which isn't really anything. I mean, I've been part of the evolution of these wines, certainly in the last 5-6 years. So I feel like my fingerprint has already been placed on these wines. But it's been a challenge stepping into the role, because there's just a lot of oversight that I didn't have to do before. Managing all the acquisition of new equipment, presenting to the board justification for new equipment, really monitoring the budget. Like a lot of these managerial office type responsibilities that now I have. And now the buck stops with me. When something's flawed with the wine, when the sales team is unhappy with something with the wine, that stops with me. And that's something I'm still wrapping my brain around. Fortunately, we have a very supportive team, and I have a very supportive boss. So I feel like I couldn't be set up for success any better than I am right now. And the other big change is letting things go. Like I worked hard to hire a really good team to make the wine with me and support me. I feel really solid on the team we have in place right now. And now it's just me letting things go, which I'm excited to do, because I have people who I think are eager and I think are capable of doing it. So it's always hard to let go of things that become yours, but it's an important part of the change, and it's an important part of other people's career development, is that they have the opportunities that I had. So being a manager, I was a manager before, but now I'm the manager of the programs and the people, which I think management is the greatest highs and the greatest lows of a job. But it's been very rewarding. I'm definitely nervous going into this harvest. I'm not going to be there by myself. Alex is still the viticulturist, so he's still part of the production. But I'll be making the pick decisions and doing the pick calendar and working with all that scheduling. It's just a lot more logistics. It's not just the logistics in the winery, it's the logistics in the vineyard. So managing that, it'll be a big transition. I'm excited though. I'm excited to take on these new challenges. It's definitely, I didn't feel like I was stagnant before, but now that I have these new opportunities, I'm like, I think I was kind of stagnant. Like I was happy, but it's been, fun, frustrating, overwhelming, and exciting to come into this role. And especially here at Sokol Blosser, it just didn't occur to me that I would have this position here. So it was a mind shift. But I feel honored to have it, and to have it here at Sokol Blosser.
So you come in your first harvest in that role. Tell me about, you get to the first harvest, you get a year or two under your belt in this position. What are some things you're looking ahead to in the future that you either haven't tried yet or want to tweak a little bit?
I'd like to work with more Pinot Noir from different AVAs. So, I mean, we've really been primarily focused on the Dundee Hills, obviously. We have one site in the old Amity Hills, but that's mostly been used for a sparkling base. And then we purchased Kalita Vineyard in 2021 in the Carlton district, and that fruit is so different. And I didn't really realize until I was working with the fruit from the ground up how radically different that AVA was. And so I am now more excited to look at other vineyard sites, purchased fruit from other vineyard sites, other AVAs, and really have that portfolio going in our tasting room. So that would be what I would look forward to in the next few years. We're bringing a Pinot Blanc program on board. So working with that variety a little bit more. And then also our Chardonnay program is really in its infancy. And especially Chardonnay from our estate vineyards. We planted some in 2019. So that's really starting to come on board. It's been past couple years have been kind of rough on Chardonnay. So that should be in pretty full production this year. And then we grafted some Pinot Gris vines over in our Eola Amity site to Chardonnay. So that'll be interesting to work with 2 AVAs with Chardonnay. So I think that will be a program that I can make a big impact on is our Chardonnay. And of course, it's Chardonnay from the Willamette Valley has been in the news a lot. So, I mean, you go outside of Oregon and it's still little known about it, even though it's been in the media. So there's a lot of growth and potential in that program.
So kind of zooming out a little bit and talking about the industry, tell me about how you've seen the Oregon wine industry change since you've been a part of it and what the industry looks like now in 2023.
I mean, I've been a part of it since 2005 and it has grown so much. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, the number of vineyards and wineries that have come on in nearly 20 years, but it's massive. But I will say what's stayed consistent is the collegiality of the valley, of the industry in general, and within Oregon. So I would just say there's been more and more small producers coming on site, and then also more purchasing. Jackson coming in and purchasing several different vineyards and wine labels, which I think has been to our benefit. I mean, they're funding all this research for smoke, which is to be shared with the industry as a whole. California, New Zealand, Australia, but that money is important to the development, and these smaller facilities, we don't have the money to fund all that research. So it's been a positive change. Also kind of sad to see more and more independent wineries disappear, I guess, to a certain degree. So it's pluses and minuses in that transition. But I do understand why it's happening. I mean, if your kids don't want to take over the company, I mean, you need a retirement plan. So I respect why people are doing it. It's also this is a tough business financially. This is really tough. I mean, the Sokol Blossers have been doing this for 50 years, so we have a good foundation. But to come in now that's a tough road financially. So I understand why people are selling to larger operations. So that's been a big change that I've seen in my years here. More and more vineyard sites coming in. AVAs are being developed, sub-AVAs are being developed. So that's been really interesting to see that come into play. I haven't been part of them. And where we're at today is, the sparkling, I think, has been, the sparkling and the Chardonnay programs coming into the Willamette Valley have been the biggest changes, which I think are really exciting. And I'm excited to put a stamp out there on Willamette Valley sparkling. Like, I think we can produce some really interesting sparklings that the world will enjoy and can compete with champagne. I mean, it's hard to compete with the name champagne, but I feel like in a tasting, we have some solid competitors out there. And with a price that's a little more approachable than champagne. So, and I just see the Oregon wine industry just continuing to develop. I mean, we're putting money into research at OSU, with Schmidt. We're producing more and more people who are tied to this state, with the Linfield program and Schmidt and Oregon State really focusing. And so that's fun to see people who are already connected with the state come into the industry. And I think that will help take us continue to take us in a positive direction. People who are tied to home. And I just, we just finished Oregon Pinot Camp, which is very rewarding. It's so fun to see these people come in that know limited information about Oregon. They like Oregon, but, and they just, to run into these campers at the end of the event, and they just, they're just thrilled with their experience, and they're going to take it literally all over the world and preach the Oregon wine industry gospel, and that's, exciting. We're getting out there. We're still small. I think we're 1.4% of the worldwide sale of wine. So we're really small, and we have a lot to say, and I think it's just going to grow from there.
For your personal future, anything else you're looking ahead to, either professionally or personally, that is on your horizon?
Well, I think I got a lot going on professionally right now in my new role. And then personally, my husband and I bought a property a couple years ago, and I am not planting a vineyard, but there is a lot of landscaping to be done, so that takes a lot of my time. And just getting out and traveling more again. There's so many places in the world I need to go. I keep going back to France, but there's so many places I need to get out and explore still. So that's probably my next passion, is traveling. I feel very rewarded traveling, and I feel like I come back with even if the trip is unrelated to wine, I always come back with a fresh view on wine. It's just nice to step away from every day and see something different and taste different food, and so that's the next personal journey, is getting out and traveling more.
And as you look back, what do you feel like is your biggest accomplishment?
That's a hard question.
Well, people don't ask you that very often.
No, they don't. I don't know. I think I'm most proud of the fact that I made a life for myself here in Oregon, all by myself. My dad drove me out here. I knew no one. I'm 2,000 miles from everything I know. And I made friends. I started a career. I met my husband. We bought a house. I was just this shy little girl in Michigan, and I came out here all by myself and started a life and a career, and a successful career. And I think I'm most proud of that I stepped out of my comfort zone, and have had failures, but overall successes in my life.
And any day now, you'll stop for that real job.
Any day now. Someday I'm gonna find the time to look for that real job.
Final question for you. If someone were to ask you for words of wisdom or advice on joining the Oregon wine industry, what would you tell them?
Definitely work harvest. Even if you want to go into a different department within the industry, I highly recommend working harvest and learning some production, because it all ties back to production, be it your sales, marketing, accounting. I just think there's something to be learned from the foundation of the industry, which is producing the wine.
All right. That's all the questions I have for you.
Okay.
Anything I didn't ask that I should have? Anything we didn't cover today that you'd like to cover?
No, we didn't go over my dental records, but I think we covered a lot.
Fingerprints. FBI file.
Yeah.
We'll get to that next time. Well, thank you so much for taking the time and sharing with us today, sharing this beautiful space and sharing your stories. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
We'll go ahead and let you off the hook.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.